Eleanor Morrison's weathered hands froze mid-reach for her morning coffee, the steam curling forgotten as she stared through her kitchen window at the impossible sight unfolding in her Montana clearing. A massive grizzly bear was dragging a torn medical bag across the pine needles, but that wasn't what made her breath catch in her throat. It was the small bear cub methodically removing surgical instruments from the bag with startling precision. The coffee mug slipped from Eleanor's grip, shattering against the cabin floor as her 68-year-old knees buckled. Through the sudden silence of the mountain morning, she could hear her own ragged breathing mixing with the soft grunts of the dying mother bear lying motionless nearby. This wasn't some Disney fantasy. This was her late mentor's medical kit, lost 20 years ago in these same woods when Dr. James Patterson died in what everyone believed was a tragic bear attack. "Dear God," she whispered, pressing trembling fingers against the cool glass. How could a wild animal know to clean a wound? And why did this feel less like coincidence and more like destiny calling her name? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Eleanor Morrison had always believed that life's cruelest joke was giving someone a heart big enough to love the whole world, then taking away everyone worth loving. At 68, she'd buried her husband Frank just 2 years ago after watching cancer slowly steal the man who'd promised her 50 golden years together. Before Frank, there had been the baby, their only pregnancy lost at 28 weeks, taking with it not just their dreams of parenthood, but Eleanor's faith that good things happened to good people. The remote cabin in Flathead National Forest had been Frank's retirement dream, a place where they'd planned to watch grandchildren chase fireflies and teach them the names of wildflowers. Instead, Eleanor found herself rattling around 1,500 square feet of knotty pine and memories, 3 months into a solitude so complete that she'd started talking to Frank's empty coffee mug each morning. "Well, honey, another day in paradise," she'd say, her voice echoing off walls that seemed to grow closer each week. Her veterinary practice in Billings had been sold to pay Frank's medical bills, leaving her with enough to survive but not enough to truly live. The foreclosure notice tucked behind the sugar bowl served as a daily reminder that even this sanctuary wouldn't be hers much longer. The developers circled like vultures, offering cash for her 100 acres that bordered Glacier National Park, eager to build another luxury resort where ancient trees now stood. Eleanor had spent 43 years healing animals, from prize-winning quarter horses to abandoned puppies that nobody else would touch. Frank used to joke that she spoke better retriever than English, but the truth was simpler. Animals didn't lie, didn't cheat, didn't promise forever and then leave you behind. They just loved with everything they had until they couldn't anymore. The morning routine never changed. Coffee at 6:30 sharp. Standing at the kitchen window that faced the natural clearing where deer came to drink from the spring-fed creek. Frank had installed that window specifically for her, knowing she'd need something beautiful to look at during the long Montana winters. "Every woman needs a view of something worth protecting," he'd said while caulking the frame. She'd been reaching for her second cup when the impossible sight stopped her cold. The massive grizzly sow dragging what looked like a medical bag should have sent her reaching for the rifle Frank had insisted on keeping by the door. Instead, something in the bear's deliberate movements, the careful way she positioned the bag near her injured flank, made Eleanor's trained eye focus differently. 43 years of veterinary experience had taught her to read animal behavior like sheet music, and what she was seeing didn't match any natural pattern she knew. The small cub wasn't playing or exploring. He was working with the methodical precision of someone following learned procedures. Dr. James Patterson's voice echoed from her veterinary school days. "Eleanor, the day you stop being amazed by what animals can teach us is the day you should hang up your stethoscope." Today, apparently, was not that day. Eleanor's bare feet barely registered the cold morning dew as she stepped onto her porch, every instinct screaming at her to retreat, while her veterinary training pulled her forward. The grizzly sow lay on her side approximately 40 yards away, her massive chest rising and falling in the labored rhythm Eleanor recognized as severe distress. What made her breath catch wasn't the size of the bear. She'd seen plenty of grizzlies in her years treating ranch animals near the park, but the deliberate way the cub was positioning himself beside a torn canvas medical bag. "Easy now," she whispered, more to herself than the bears, her voice barely audible above the morning breeze rustling through the ponderosa pines. The cub's head snapped up at the sound, but instead of the startled flight response she expected, he simply watched her with dark eyes that seemed far too knowing for a creature that couldn't be more than 8 months old. Eleanor took another step, then another, her retired veterinarian's eye automatically cataloging what she observed. The sow's left hind leg was swollen, the fur matted with what looked like dried blood and pus. The smell hit her next, the unmistakable, sweet-sick odor of infection that meant systemic toxicity wasn't far behind. Without intervention, the bear would be dead within days, probably hours. The medical bag lay open between them, its contents scattered across the pine needles in a way that should have been random but wasn't. Antiseptic bottles stood upright. Gauze packages were arranged in neat rows. A small pair of surgical scissors gleamed in the early sunlight, positioned just within the cub's reach. "This isn't possible," Eleanor murmured, taking another careful step forward. The cub didn't retreat. Instead, he picked up a bottle of antiseptic with his small paws and held it toward her, as if offering assistance. Eleanor's knees nearly buckled. In 43 years of veterinary practice, she'd seen plenty of intelligent animal behavior. Dogs that could detect seizures, horses that refused to step on unstable ground, cats that seemed to know when their humans were dying. But this was different. This was purposeful manipulation of medical tools by a wild animal that shouldn't have any concept of human medicine. She crouched down slowly, extending her hand palm up in the universal gesture of non-aggression. The cub approached without hesitation, close enough that she could see the intelligence burning in his dark eyes, close enough to notice the way he favored his right front paw, where a small cut had been carefully cleaned and wrapped with gauze. "You did that yourself, didn't you?" she whispered, examining his primitive bandage. "Someone taught you, or you figured it out by watching?" The memory hit her like a physical blow. 20 years ago, Dr. James Patterson had disappeared during a research expedition in these same mountains. His body was found 3 days later, mauled by what wildlife officials assumed was a defensive bear protecting cubs. His medical bag was never recovered, presumed destroyed or dragged away by scavengers. Eleanor's hand trembling, she reached for the bag's torn fabric. There, barely visible beneath layers of weather damage and claw marks, was the faded inscription she'd helped embroider during her residency. Dr. J. Patterson, DVM, healer of all God's creatures. "Oh, James," she breathed, understanding flooding through her like ice water. "What happened to you out here?" The cub moved again, this time picking up a package of sterile gauze and placing it deliberately beside the antiseptic. His actions weren't random or playful. They were methodical, organized, purposeful. Someone or something had taught him basic medical procedures, and now he was trying to save his mother's life with tools he barely understood but somehow knew how to use. Eleanor looked at the dying sow, then at her cub who refused to abandon her, and felt something shift deep in her chest. For 2 years since Frank's death, she'd been drifting through her days like a ghost, haunting her own life. She'd lost her practice, her husband, her sense of purpose. The foreclosure notice sitting on her kitchen table was just the final punctuation mark on a story that felt already finished. But this was different. This was a creature in desperate need of help, guided by instincts or training that defied everything she thought she knew about wildlife behavior. This was a mystery wrapped in a miracle, delivered to her doorstep by a cub who somehow understood that she was exactly the right person to find. "I don't know how you know what you know," she told the cub softly, reaching for her veterinary training like an old friend. "But your mama's dying, and if we're going to save her, we need to work together." The cub looked up at her and made a soft huffing sound that impossibly sounded almost like agreement. Eleanor Morrison, retired veterinarian and recent widow, was about to perform emergency surgery on a wild grizzly bear with the assistance of her 8-month-old cub. Frank would have called her crazy. Dr. Patterson would have called it miraculous. Eleanor called it Tuesday morning and got to work. The gunshot wound in Luna's hind leg was worse than Eleanor had initially thought. As she carefully cleaned away the matted fur and dried blood, the full extent of the damage became clear. A bullet had torn through muscle and lodged against the femur, creating a pocket of infection that had been festering for at least a week. The smell made her eyes water, but she'd worked through worse during her years treating ranch animals. What stopped her cold wasn't the wound itself, but the way the cub, she'd started thinking of him as Marcus after her late father, anticipated her every move. When she reached for sterile gauze, he was already pushing the package toward her with his small paws. When she needed the antiseptic, he had it ready. Most unnervingly, when she hesitated over which instrument to use next, he would gently touch the correct one with his nose. "This is impossible," she muttered, using a pair of forceps to probe the wound channel. "You're 8 months old." "You shouldn't know the difference between a scalpel and a spatula, let alone which one I need." Marcus huffed softly and nudged a small bottle of antibiotics closer to her elbow. Eleanor stared at him, then at the bottle, then back at him. The antibiotic was exactly what Luna needed, but it wasn't something any wild animal should recognize, much less recommend. The satellite phone on her belt buzzed, making her jump. Eleanor glanced at the caller ID and felt her stomach drop. Richard Blackstone, the regional wildlife conservationist who'd been trying to buy her property for months. She'd initially been grateful for his interest in preserving the land until she realized his conservation group was funded entirely by a luxury resort development company. "Dr. Morrison?" Blackstone's smooth voice carried clearly through the phone's speaker. "I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. I wanted to follow up on our conversation about your property." Eleanor looked down at her hands covered in bear blood, then at Marcus, who had somehow managed to thread a suture needle while she was distracted. "Actually, Richard, now isn't the best time." Of course. I just wanted you to know that our offer has increased. The board is prepared to pay fair market value plus 20% if you're willing to close quickly. I know things have been difficult since Frank passed." The manipulation in his voice was subtle but unmistakable. Eleanor had heard it before from clients who thought a widowed veterinarian would be easy to pressure. "I appreciate the offer, but I'm not ready to sell." "Eleanor, may I speak frankly? You're sitting on 100 acres of prime real estate, alone, with no source of income. The property taxes alone must be crushing. Wouldn't Frank want you to be financially secure?" Marcus looked up from the suture he'd been holding and made a low sound that didn't quite qualify as a growl, but carried clear disapproval. Eleanor found herself oddly comforted by his reaction. "Frank would want me to do what feels right," she said firmly. "And right now that's staying put." "Well, the offer stands. But Eleanor, I hope you're being careful out there. We've had reports of aggressive bear activity in your area. A sow with cubs can be extremely dangerous, especially if she's injured or stressed. If you see anything unusual, please call immediately." The line went dead, leaving Eleanor staring at the phone with a growing sense of unease. How had Blackstone known about injured bears in her area? The nearest neighbor was 15 miles away, and she hadn't reported anything to wildlife authorities. Marcus touched her arm gently with his paw, drawing her attention back to Luna. The wound was clean now, ready for sutures, but Eleanor's hands were shaking as the implications of Blackstone's call sank in. If there had been reports of bear activity, someone had been watching her property. Someone had seen Luna and Marcus. "We need to work faster," she told Marcus, who seemed to understand the urgency in her voice. He positioned himself to hold the wound edges together while Eleanor began suturing, his small paws surprisingly steady and strong. As she worked, Eleanor's mind raced through the timeline. Luna's wound was at least a week old, which meant she'd been shot somewhere else and had traveled here seeking help. But why here? Why Eleanor's property specifically? The answer came in fragments as she noticed details she'd missed before. Marcus knew exactly where everything was in Patterson's medical bag. He didn't search or explore. He went straight to what he needed with the confidence of familiarity. The bandage on his own paw wasn't just applied, it was applied correctly, with proper pressure and secure knots that wouldn't slip. "Someone taught you," Eleanor said softly, tying off the final suture. "Someone spent time with you, showed you these things, but who and why?" Marcus looked at her with those impossibly knowing eyes and made a sound that was almost conversational, as if he were trying to explain something she couldn't quite understand. Then he did something that made Eleanor's breath catch. He picked up Patterson's old stethoscope and held it toward her, as if suggesting she check Luna's heartbeat. Eleanor took the stethoscope with trembling hands. Luna's heartbeat was stronger now, more regular. The antibiotics were already working, and the surgical site looked clean and properly closed. Marcus had helped her perform veterinary surgery with the skill of a trained assistant. "You're not just smart," Eleanor whispered, looking into his dark eyes. "You're trained." "Someone spent months teaching you these things. But Patterson died 20 years ago, and you're barely 8 months old." Marcus tilted his head as if considering whether to trust her with a secret. Then he stood and walked toward the tree line, looking back over his shoulder with an expression that clearly said, "Follow me." Eleanor looked at Luna, sleeping peacefully for the first time in days, then at Marcus, waiting patiently for her decision. Whatever answers he was offering, she had the feeling they were going to change everything she thought she knew about the mountains, the bears, and the mysterious death of Dr. James Patterson. Marcus led Eleanor through a maze of fallen logs and dense undergrowth to a natural cave hidden behind a curtain of mountain laurel. The entrance was barely visible, camouflaged so well that Eleanor would have walked past it 100 times without noticing. Inside, her flashlight beam revealed something that made her knees weak, a carefully arranged cache of medical supplies, research notebooks, and photographs, all preserved in waterproof containers. "Dear God, Marcus," she whispered, kneeling beside a stack of journals bound in oiled leather. "How long has this been here?" The topmost journal bore Dr. James Patterson's distinctive handwriting, but the dates made Eleanor's hands shake. The entries weren't 20 years old. They were recent, spanning the last 2 years. Some were written in Patterson's careful script, others in a different hand entirely. As she read, the impossible story began to unfold. Patterson hadn't died in a bear attack. He'd been shot by poachers while protecting a family of unusually intelligent grizzlies who had learned to associate him with medical care. The bear attack had been staged to cover up his murder, his body positioned to look like the victim of animal aggression. But Patterson had survived long enough to pass his knowledge to an unlikely student, Marcus's father, a massive grizzly who had watched Patterson treat injured wildlife for months. The journal entries described years of patient teaching, with Patterson using simple conditioning techniques to train the bear family in basic medical procedures, not through any kind of scientific experiment, but through the practical necessity of treating injuries in animals who couldn't be brought to a clinic. Patterson had discovered that some bears possessed remarkable learning abilities, far beyond what conventional wildlife research suggested. Eleanor's hands trembled as she read Patterson's final entries. He'd known the poachers were closing in, known they wanted to capture the intelligent bears for sale to private collectors. His last entry was a desperate plea. "If something happens to me, I pray someone will continue what we've started here. These animals deserve protection, not exploitation. They've learned to trust, and that trust must not be betrayed." A photograph tucked between the pages showed Patterson with a massive male grizzly who looked remarkably like Marcus. The bear was holding a gauze pad while Patterson cleaned a wound on another animal. The intelligence in the bear's eyes was unmistakable, as was the gentle care with which he handled the medical supplies. Marcus nudged her elbow and pointed to another journal, this one more recent. The handwriting was shakier, clearly from someone injured or in distress. The name on the cover made Eleanor gasp. Frank Morrison, her late husband. "Frank?" she breathed, opening the journal with hands that could barely hold steady. "Frank, what were you doing out here?" The entries were dated from just before Frank's cancer diagnosis, describing secret trips to the mountains during Eleanor's long hours at the veterinary clinic. Frank had discovered the cave by accident while hiking, found Patterson's research, and had been quietly continuing the work. He'd been the one training Marcus, teaching him the skills that had saved Luna's life that morning. Frank's words blurred through Eleanor's tears. "Eleanor thinks I'm at physical therapy, but I'm really here with the bears. Marcus is incredible. He learns faster than any student I ever taught. I wish I could tell Eleanor about this, but she'd never believe it. She'd think the cancer has affected my mind. When I'm gone, I hope somehow she'll find this place. I hope she'll understand that some kinds of teaching transcend species, and some kinds of love transcend everything else." The final entry was dated just a week before Frank's death. "The cancer is winning, but Marcus isn't ready yet. I've taught him what I can, but he needs more time. Eleanor is the only one with the knowledge and skill to continue what Patterson started. I pray that when the time comes, Marcus will remember enough to find her. I pray she'll trust her instincts instead of her doubts. I've seen miracles in these mountains, Eleanor. I hope you will too." Eleanor sank to the cave floor, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she'd discovered. Frank had been secretly working with the bears during the months she thought he was giving up, using his remaining strength to pass on knowledge that could save lives. Marcus had been his student, his legacy, his gift to her. Marcus whined softly and placed his paw on her shoulder, as if sensing her emotional turmoil. Through her tears, Eleanor realized he was trying to comfort her exactly the way Frank used to, with gentle pressure and patient presence. "You brought your mother to me because Frank taught you I could help," she said, stroking Marcus's head. "This wasn't chance. This was Frank's plan." Marcus huffed in agreement and moved to another container, this one filled with photographs spanning 2 decades. Pictures of Patterson with various bear families, all showing the same remarkable intelligence and cooperation. Pictures of Frank in his final months, thin but smiling as he worked alongside Marcus and Luna. And finally, pictures of Eleanor herself, taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. Eleanor working in her clinic, Eleanor crying over Frank's hospital bed, Eleanor standing alone on her porch after the funeral. Someone had been watching her, documenting her life, waiting for the right moment to make contact. The realization should have been terrifying, but instead Eleanor felt something she hadn't experienced in 2 years, a sense of being truly seen, truly known. The satellite phone on her belt buzzed again. Blackstone's number appeared on the screen, but this time Eleanor let it go to voicemail. Something about his earlier call nagged at her. His knowledge of bear activity, his urgency about the sale, his subtle threats about safety. When she played back the message, his words confirmed her growing suspicions. "Eleanor, I know you're screening my calls, but this is urgent. We have reliable intelligence about a dangerous bear situation on your property. These animals have been involved in previous incidents, and they pose a significant threat to public safety. Our team is prepared to handle the situation humanely, but we need access to your land immediately. The longer you delay, the more dangerous this becomes." Eleanor's blood ran cold. Blackstone wasn't trying to help. He was hunting Marcus and Luna. The dangerous bear situation was exactly what Patterson had warned about in his journals. The intelligent bears were being targeted not for public safety, but for their extraordinary abilities. Marcus had been listening to the message too, and his reaction was immediate and terrifying. He made a low sound deep in his throat that raised every hair on Eleanor's arms, then moved to the cave entrance and peered out through the laurel screen. His body language had changed completely, from trusting companion to alert sentinel watching for threats. "They're coming for you, aren't they?" Eleanor said, understanding flooding through her. "That's why Luna was shot. That's why she brought you to me. She knew they were hunting your family." Marcus looked back at her with eyes that held too much understanding for comfort. In that moment, Eleanor realized that everything she thought she knew about animal intelligence, about the relationship between humans and wildlife, about her own purpose in life, had been fundamentally wrong. Frank had tried to prepare her for this moment through his secret work in the mountains. Patterson had died protecting these extraordinary creatures. Now the responsibility had fallen to her, a widowed veterinarian with nothing left to lose and everything to gain. Eleanor Morrison had spent 2 years feeling like her life was over. Now, looking into Marcus's trusting eyes while Luna recovered from surgery that had saved her life, she realized her real purpose was just beginning. The foreclosure notice in her kitchen seemed insignificant compared to the choice she faced now. She could surrender Marcus and Luna to people who saw them as valuable commodities, sell her property, and spend her remaining years in comfortable isolation. Or she could fight to protect creatures who had learned to trust humans at enormous personal cost. Marcus touched her hand with his paw, and Eleanor felt Frank's presence as clearly as if he were standing beside her. Some kinds of love transcended death just as some kinds of teaching transcended species. "All right, sweet boy," she said, standing and gathering the journals into her arms. "Let's go home and figure out how to keep your family safe." The sound of helicopters reached Eleanor's cabin at dawn, their mechanical thrumming cutting through the mountain silence like chainsaws through cathedral quiet. Marcus lifted his head from where he'd been sleeping beside Luna's makeshift recovery bed in Eleanor's living room, his ears flattening against his skull in obvious distress. Luna, still weak from surgery but alert, made a low, rumbling sound that vibrated through the cabin floor. Eleanor peered through her kitchen window and felt her heart sink. 3 black helicopters circled her property in a coordinated pattern while armed vehicles wound up the access road. This wasn't a wildlife rescue operation. This was a military-style extraction, complete with uniformed personnel carrying tranquilizer rifles and reinforced transport cages. "They found us," she whispered, watching Marcus position himself protectively between Luna and the windows. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart." "I should have been ready for this." Her satellite phone rang insistently. Blackstone's name appeared on the screen, but this time Eleanor answered with grim determination. "Dr. Morrison, I hope you can see that we're serious about resolving this situation." Blackstone's voice carried a cold authority she hadn't heard before. "We have your property surrounded. The bears you're harboring are extremely dangerous and must be contained immediately." "These bears aren't dangerous, Richard. They're injured and recovering from surgery. They haven't threatened anyone." Blackstone's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Eleanor, you have no idea what you're dealing with. These animals have been trained to interact with humans in ways that violate every principle of wildlife management. They represent a significant biosecurity risk." "Biosecurity risk?" Eleanor's voice rose despite her efforts to stay calm. "They're a family trying to survive." The mother was shot by poachers, for God's sake. The mother was shot during a legitimate wildlife management operation after she attacked a research team. The cub has been exhibiting abnormal behavior patterns that suggest exposure to experimental conditioning protocols. Both animals need to be quarantined and studied. Through her window, Eleanor watched armed figures spreading out around her cabin, their movements precise and coordinated. These weren't wildlife officers. They moved like military contractors, like people accustomed to taking what they wanted through force. Marcus had been listening to the conversation, and now he did something that stopped Eleanor's breath. He walked deliberately to the satellite phone, placed his paw on the speaker button, and made a series of soft huffing sounds that were clearly directed at Blackstone. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for long seconds before Blackstone spoke again, his voice tight with barely controlled excitement. "Eleanor, did that animal just respond to my voice? Did it understand our conversation?" Eleanor's hand trembled as she realized the magnitude of her mistake. By allowing Marcus to hear the phone call, she'd confirmed Blackstone's suspicions about the bear's unusual intelligence. She'd essentially signed their death warrant. "Richard, please, whatever you think these bears are, whatever you think they're worth, they're just a family trying to survive. The cub lost his father to your legitimate wildlife management operation. The mother nearly died protecting him. Haven't they suffered enough?" "Suffered?" Blackstone's voice carried a note of genuine confusion. "Eleanor, you're anthropomorphizing wild animals. These bears aren't a family in any meaningful sense. They're specimens, incredibly valuable specimens that could revolutionize our understanding of animal cognition. The research potential alone is worth millions." Eleanor looked at Marcus, who was now gently grooming Luna's fur around her surgical site with the careful attention of a devoted son caring for his mother. The love between them was so obvious, so unmistakably real, that Blackstone's words felt like blasphemy. "They're not specimens, Richard. They're individuals with relationships, emotions, intelligence. The cub learned medical procedures by watching humans help his family. He saved his mother's life using skills he learned through love and trust." "Exactly!" Blackstone's excitement was palpable now. "Do you understand how unprecedented this is? We're talking about cognitive abilities that shouldn't exist in wild animals. The applications for military training, for research, for entertainment. The potential is limitless." Eleanor felt sick. Entertainment. Military training. She could envision Marcus and Luna in cages, performing tricks for crowds, or being subjected to psychological experiments designed to understand their intelligence so it could be replicated or exploited. Through her window, she watched a team of specialists assembling what looked like a sophisticated capture apparatus: nets, tranquilizer equipment, reinforced transport containers sized for grizzly bears. These people had come prepared for exactly this scenario. Marcus touched her hand with his paw and looked directly into her eyes. In that moment, Eleanor saw something that made her chest tight with recognition. The same expression Frank used to get when he was preparing to tell her something difficult but necessary. Marcus was trying to communicate something important. He walked to the front door and looked back at her, then at Luna, then at the door again. His message was clear. He wanted to surrender himself to protect his mother. "No," Eleanor said firmly, kneeling beside him. "No, sweetheart. We don't abandon family. That's not what your father taught you, and it's not what my husband would have wanted." The sound of boots on her porch steps made them all freeze. A sharp knock echoed through the cabin, followed by Blackstone's voice, no longer coming through the phone, but from directly outside her door. "Dr. Morrison, this is your final opportunity to cooperate voluntarily. We have legal authority to remove dangerous wildlife from private property, and we're prepared to use it. Open the door and step aside." Eleanor looked at the foreclosure notice still tucked behind her sugar bowl, then at Marcus and Luna huddled together in her living room. She thought of Frank's secret work in the mountains, of Patterson's murder 20 years ago, of all the people who had fought to protect these extraordinary creatures. "Legal authority from whom?" she called back, buying time while her mind raced through options. "The Department of Natural Resources has classified these animals as a public safety threat based on documented aggressive behavior and abnormal conditioning. We're authorized to use whatever force is necessary to secure them." Marcus made a soft sound and moved to Eleanor's side, pressing against her leg in a gesture of support that reminded her painfully of Frank during his final weeks. Luna struggled to stand despite her weakness, positioning herself as best she could to protect her son. Eleanor realized that this moment had been inevitable from the day Patterson first began working with the Bear family. Someone would always want to exploit their intelligence, cage their freedom, turn their extraordinary abilities into profit. The only question was whether she would be the person who stood in the way or the one who stepped aside. She thought of Frank's journal entry about miracles in the mountains, about trust that must not be betrayed. She thought of her empty veterinary practice, her pending foreclosure, her carefully planned retirement that had become a slow march toward irrelevance. Then she looked at Marcus, who was watching her with complete faith that she would make the right choice, and felt something she hadn't experienced since Frank's death, a sense of absolute clarity about her purpose. Eleanor Morrison walked to her front door, turned the deadbolt, and spoke in a voice that carried 43 years of veterinary authority. "Richard, these animals are under my care as a licensed veterinarian treating injured wildlife. They're not going anywhere until I determine they're healthy enough for release. If you want them, you'll have to go through me." The silence outside her door was profound. Then Blackstone's voice came back, colder than the Montana wind. "Eleanor, you're making a very serious mistake. These animals are worth more than your entire property. People will pay extraordinary amounts for creatures this unique. Don't throw away your financial security for wild animals that don't even understand the concept of gratitude." Marcus looked up at Eleanor and made a soft huffing sound that she could have sworn sounded like "thank you." "I think you're wrong about gratitude, Richard," Eleanor said quietly. "I think you're wrong about a lot of things." The boots on her porch retreated, but Eleanor knew this was far from over. Through her window, she could see Blackstone talking into a radio, his gestures sharp and angry. More vehicles were arriving, and the helicopters maintained their circling pattern overhead. Marcus touched her hand again and looked toward the back of the cabin, toward the mountains, where his father had learned to trust humans who deserved that trust. His message was clear. It was time to run. The tranquilizer dart hit Luna in the neck just as Eleanor was helping her through the cabin's back door. The massive Grizzly stumbled, her legs buckling as the powerful sedative coursed through her system. Marcus let out a sound Eleanor had never heard before, a keening wail that cut through her heart like broken glass, the cry of a child watching his mother collapse. "Luna!" Eleanor dropped to her knees beside the fallen bear, checking her pulse while Marcus frantically licked his mother's face, trying to wake her. "No, no, no! She's still weak from surgery. This much sedative could kill her." Blackstone's voice carried across the clearing as armed figures emerged from the tree line. "Excellent shot, Martinez. The adult is secured. Now we need the cub alive and unharmed. He's worth significantly more if he's not damaged." Eleanor's blood turned to ice water. Worth more. They were talking about Marcus like he was merchandise, a commodity to be bought and sold. She watched in horror as 3 men with capture nets approached from different angles, their movements coordinated and professional. Marcus stayed beside his unconscious mother, but his head swiveled to track each approaching threat. Eleanor had never seen him look dangerous before, but now she glimpsed the wild grizzly he could become if pushed too far. His lips pulled back in a snarl that showed teeth designed for tearing flesh. and the sound that rumbled from his chest made the armed men hesitate. "Careful," Blackstone called out. "Don't provoke him into a full defensive response. We need him functional for the buyers." Buyers. The word hit Eleanor like a physical blow. This wasn't about research or public safety, it was about money. Marcus and Luna were being sold to the highest bidder, probably to some private collector who wanted living trophies of their intelligence. "Richard, please." Eleanor stood slowly, placing herself between Marcus and the approaching nets. "These are wild animals, not property. You can't just steal them from their natural habitat." "Actually, Eleanor, I can." Blackstone stepped into view, no longer bothering to maintain his facade of conservation concern. "These animals pose a documented threat to public safety. The state has granted my organization full authority to relocate them to appropriate facilities." "What facilities? Where are you taking them?" Blackstone's smile was cold and reptilian. "That's classified information. What I can tell you is that they'll be well cared for, and their unique abilities will be studied by some of the most qualified researchers in the world." Marcus pressed against Eleanor's legs, trembling with fear and rage. She could feel his rapid heartbeat through his fur, could sense his desperate desire to fight, combined with his training to trust humans. Frank had taught him to be gentle, to solve problems with intelligence rather than violence. Now that conditioning was working against him as he struggled with instincts that screamed at him to attack, "Eleanor, step away from the animal." One of the armed men raised his tranquilizer rifle, the dart aimed directly at Marcus. "We don't want to hurt you, but that bear is exhibiting aggressive behavior." "He's protecting his unconscious mother." Eleanor's voice cracked with fury. "Any creature would be aggressive in this situation. You shot her with enough sedative to drop a horse, and she's still recovering from surgery." "Surgery you performed illegally," Blackstone pointed out smoothly. "Treating wild animals without proper permits is a federal offense, Eleanor. You're looking at serious jail time unless you cooperate." The net fell over Marcus before Eleanor could react. The heavy mesh entangled his limbs as he thrashed wildly, his panic making the situation worse with each desperate movement. Eleanor lunged forward to help him, but strong hands grabbed her arms and pulled her back. "Let him go!" she screamed, fighting against her captors. "He's just a baby. He's scared." Marcus's cries of distress echoed off the mountain walls as more nets were thrown over him. Eleanor watched in helpless horror as the creature who had saved his mother's life with gentle paws and careful attention was treated like a dangerous predator. Each sound of fear he made felt like a knife in her chest. "The truck is ready," someone called from the access road. "We can have both animals at the facility within 3 hours." Eleanor's heart stopped. Once Marcus and Luna disappeared into Blackstone's facility, she would never see them again. They would become test subjects, entertainment for wealthy collectors, breeding stock for producing more intelligent bears. Everything Frank and Patterson had worked to protect would be destroyed for profit. Marcus managed to get one paw free from the netting and reached toward Eleanor, his dark eyes wide with terror and confusion. In that moment, she saw not just a remarkable animal, but the grandchild she'd never had. The family member Frank had secretly prepared for her, the living embodiment of love that transcended species. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I failed you." But as the capture team struggled to secure Marcus for transport, Eleanor noticed something they had missed. Luna's eyes were open, watching the chaos with the calculating gaze of a mother whose cub was in mortal danger. The tranquilizer dart was designed for a healthy adult grizzly, not one weakened by infection and surgery. The dosage that should have kept her unconscious for hours was wearing off in minutes. Luna was pretending to be sedated, waiting for the right moment to strike. Eleanor closed her eyes and prayed to Frank, to Patterson, to anyone who might be listening, that when Luna made her move, they would all survive what came next. Luna's attack was swift and devastating. The massive Grizzly erupted from her feigned unconsciousness like a force of nature, her surgical stitches tearing as she launched herself at the nearest captor. The man holding the net over Marcus screamed as 600 pounds of enraged mother bear knocked him flat, his tranquilizer rifle skittering across the pine needles. "Shoot her! Shoot her!" Blackstone's voice cracked with panic as chaos erupted around Eleanor's cabin. The other armed men scrambled for position, but Luna was moving with the desperate fury of a mother protecting her young, and their training hadn't prepared them for an adversary this intelligent and motivated. Marcus broke free from the damaged netting and rushed to his mother's side, but instead of joining the attack, he did something that stopped Eleanor's heart. He placed himself between Luna and the armed men, making soft sounds that seemed to calm her rage. Even in the midst of violence, he was trying to protect everyone, his mother from being shot, the humans from being mauled. "Don't hurt them!" Eleanor screamed at the men scrambling for their weapons. "He's trying to stop the fighting." But her words were lost in the chaos. A tranquilizer dart meant for Luna caught Marcus in the shoulder, and the young bear stumbled as the powerful sedative began to take effect. Eleanor watched in horror as his legs buckled, his intelligent eyes growing glassy and confused. Luna's roar of grief and fury echoed off the mountain walls. She stood over her collapsing son, her massive head swiveling to track every human threat, her meaning clear. Anyone who approached would die. "The cub is down," one of the men reported into his radio, "but the adult is still active and extremely hostile. We need backup." Blackstone pulled out his own weapon, not a tranquilizer rifle, but a high-powered hunting rifle with real bullets. "Enough of this. The cub is what matters. If the adult won't cooperate, we'll eliminate the threat." "No!" Eleanor broke free from her captors and threw herself between Blackstone and Luna. "You can't kill her. She's just protecting her baby." "She's a dangerous animal that's outlived her usefulness," Blackstone snarled, raising the rifle. "The cub has all the genetic material we need. The adult is expendable." Eleanor stared down the barrel of the rifle and felt something shift inside her chest. For 2 years since Frank's death, she'd been drifting through life like a ghost, feeling useless and forgotten. Now, standing between a loaded weapon and a grieving mother, she found her purpose again. "You'll have to kill me first," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the weapon aimed at her heart. Blackstone's finger tightened on the trigger. "That can be arranged." The gunshot echoed across the mountains, but it wasn't Blackstone who fired. Eleanor spun around to see Sheriff Deputy Maria Santos emerging from the tree line with her service weapon drawn, smoke still rising from the barrel. "Drop your weapons! All of you, drop them now!" Santos commanded, her voice carrying the authority of 30 years in law enforcement. "This is an illegal wildlife trafficking operation and you're all under arrest." Blackstone's hunting rifle fell from suddenly nerveless fingers as he stared at the growing bloodstain on his shoulder. "You shot me," he said in disbelief. "You actually shot me." "You were about to murder a civilian," Santos replied coldly. "I'd say you got off light." Eleanor had never been so grateful to see another human being in her life. Maria Santos had been Frank's poker buddy and Eleanor's friend for decades, but Eleanor had no idea how she'd known to come. "Maria, how did you—" "Your husband left very detailed instructions about what to do if anything happened to the bears," Santos explained, keeping her weapon trained on Blackstone's men. "Frank visited my office 6 months before he died and left a sealed envelope with explicit directions. He said if anyone ever tried to take the bears by force, I should consider it kidnapping and respond accordingly." Frank. Even in death, her husband was still protecting the family he'd helped create. Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face as she realized the depth of Frank's planning, his faith that she would eventually find Marcus and Luna and need protection. "This is highly irregular," Blackstone protested, pressing his hand against his bleeding shoulder. "We have legal authority." "Your legal authority is fraudulent," Santos interrupted. "I've been investigating your organization for months. The Montana Department of Natural Resources never issued any permits for wildlife removal on this property. Your conservation group is actually a front for exotic animal trafficking." Eleanor watched the armed men lower their weapons as more law enforcement vehicles arrived on the scene. Marcus was unconscious but breathing steadily, the tranquilizer dose calculated for his smaller size. Luna stood guard over him, no longer aggressive but still alert, watching every movement around her son. "The FBI has been tracking illegal wildlife sales to private collectors for over a year," Santos continued, directing her officers to secure the capture equipment. "Your operation just became the centerpiece of a federal investigation." Blackstone's face had gone pale, whether from blood loss or the realization that his carefully planned operation was collapsing. "You don't understand what you're interfering with. These animals are worth millions to the right buyers." "We're talking about groundbreaking research opportunities." "We're talking about kidnapping and attempted murder," Santos corrected. "Both felonies that carry significant prison time." As the paramedics treated Blackstone's wound and the other men were loaded into police vehicles, Eleanor knelt beside Marcus's unconscious form. Luna allowed her to approach, even lowering her massive head to nuzzle Eleanor's shoulder in what could only be interpreted as gratitude. "Is he going to be okay?" Eleanor asked Santos, who was coordinating with the arriving wildlife veterinarian. "The dosage was calculated for capture, not harm," Dr. Jennifer Walsh assured her as she examined Marcus. "He'll sleep for a few hours and wake up groggy, but there shouldn't be any lasting effects." Eleanor looked around at the chaos surrounding her property: police vehicles, medical equipment, evidence teams photographing the capture gear. Just hours ago, she'd been a lonely widow facing foreclosure. Now she was at the center of a federal investigation that would likely make national news. "Frank knew this day would come," she said softly, watching Luna settle protectively beside her son. "He prepared for everything, except how to explain it to me." Santos holstered her weapon and placed a gentle hand on Eleanor's shoulder. "Frank left another envelope for you. I was instructed to give it to you after the bears were safe." Eleanor took the sealed envelope with trembling hands. Frank's familiar handwriting spelled out her name along with a single word that made her smile through her tears: "Grandma." Inside was a brief note and a legal document that would change everything. "Eleanor, if you're reading this, it means our family is safe and you've found your purpose again. The Patterson Trust has been reactivated in your name, with enough funding to establish a proper wildlife sanctuary. Marcus and Luna aren't just animals, they're our legacy. Take care of them and they'll take care of you. All my love, Frank. P.S. The trust includes a provision for your property taxes. You're not losing the cabin." Eleanor looked at Luna, who was now grooming Marcus's fur with gentle care, and felt the last piece of her broken heart click back into place. Frank had given her everything she needed to protect their extraordinary family. Now all she had to do was prove worthy of that gift. 6 months later, Eleanor stood on her front porch watching Marcus teach a group of visiting veterinary students the proper way to clean a wound. The young bear, now fully grown but still gentle as a lamb, demonstrated each step with the patience of a natural teacher while Luna supervised from her favorite sunny spot near the creek. The Patterson Wildlife Intelligence Research Sanctuary had become everything Frank had envisioned and more. Scientists from around the world came to study the remarkable cognitive abilities of the bear family, but always under strict ethical guidelines that prioritize the animal's well-being over research goals. Marcus and Luna weren't subjects. They were partners in expanding humanity's understanding of animal intelligence. Dr. Morrison, this is absolutely incredible, Dr. Sarah Chen from UC Davis whispered as Marcus carefully positioned a gauze pad over a simulated wound on a stuffed animal. I've never seen anything like this level of learned behavior in wild animals. Eleanor smiled, watching Marcus look up at the students to make sure they were following along. He's not performing tricks, Dr. Chen. He's sharing knowledge that literally saved his mother's life. There's a difference. The sanctuary had brought unexpected joy to Eleanor's life in ways she'd never imagined. The financial security from the Patterson Trust meant she could focus entirely on the bears and their care, but more importantly, she'd found the family she'd always dreamed of. Marcus had grown into a magnificent young adult, but he still touched her hand with his paw when he wanted comfort, still brought her wildflowers he'd carefully picked without damaging the stems. Luna had recovered completely from her injuries and now served as the sanctuary's gentle ambassador, allowing carefully selected visitors to observe her interactions with Marcus while maintaining the dignity and wildness that made her remarkable. The bond between mother and son remained as strong as ever, a testament to the power of love that transcended species barriers. "Grandma Eleanor," Marcus vocalized softly, using the simple words Frank had taught him during their secret sessions in the mountains. The visiting students gasped in amazement, but for Eleanor, hearing those two words never got old. Each time Marcus called her Grandma, she felt Frank's presence as clearly as if he were standing beside her. The media attention had been overwhelming at first. National Geographic had featured the sanctuary on their cover. The Discovery Channel had produced a documentary about animal intelligence that won 3 Emmy Awards. Eleanor had been interviewed by everyone from 60 Minutes to The Ellen Show, but she'd learned to protect Marcus and Luna from exploitation while still sharing their story with the world. The legal proceedings against Blackstone had revealed the scope of his illegal wildlife trafficking operation. Dozens of exotic animals had been rescued from private collectors, and new federal legislation was pending to strengthen protections for cognitively advanced animals. Blackstone himself was serving 15 years in federal prison, his organization dismantled and its assets used to fund legitimate conservation efforts. Eleanor's phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Walsh, the wildlife veterinarian who had become both colleague and close friend. "Eleanor, we have a situation. A family of orphaned wolf pups was found near Yellowstone. They've been exhibiting unusual learning behaviors. Could you consult?" Eleanor looked at Marcus, who had somehow learned to read her expressions well enough to know she was considering taking on new responsibilities. He huffed softly and touched her hand, then looked toward Luna. Their silent communication was as clear as spoken words. The sanctuary had room for more family members who needed protection and understanding. "What do you think, sweetheart?" Eleanor asked Marcus. "Ready to be a big brother?" Marcus's enthusiastic bark made the visiting students laugh with delight. Luna rose from her resting spot and approached slowly, her massive head tilting as if considering the prospect of expanding their unusual family. After a moment, she placed her paw on Eleanor's shoulder and made the low, rumbling sound that Eleanor had learned meant agreement. That evening, after the visitors had departed and the sanctuary was quiet except for the gentle sounds of the mountain wind, Eleanor sat in Frank's old rocking chair on the porch. Marcus lay at her feet, while Luna dozed nearby, both bears content in the security of their protected home. Eleanor opened the final letter Frank had left for her, saved for this moment when the sanctuary was established and their family was safe. His familiar handwriting blurred through her tears as she read, "Eleanor, if you're reading this, it means you found your way to the life we both dreamed of, but never dared to plan. You have a gift for healing that goes beyond veterinary medicine. You heal hearts, minds, and the broken trust between species. Marcus and Luna are just the beginning. There are other animals out there who need what you can offer. understanding, protection, and unconditional love. Build the family we always wanted, one rescued soul at a time. I'll be watching from the mountains, proud of the woman who chose love over fear, purpose over safety. Your devoted husband and eternal cheerleader, Frank. Eleanor folded the letter carefully and looked up at the stars appearing in the darkening sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new animals who needed sanctuary, new opportunities to bridge the gap between human and wild. But tonight, surrounded by the family that love and determination had created, Eleanor Morrison felt completely at peace. Marcus stirred at her feet and looked up with eyes that still held all the intelligence and trust that had brought them together. "Thank you, Grandma," he said softly in his limited but heartfelt vocabulary. "Thank you too, sweet boy," Eleanor whispered back. "Thank you for teaching me that family isn't about blood. It's about choosing to love without limits." In the distance, a wolf howled, and Eleanor smiled, already planning how to welcome the newest members of their extraordinary sanctuary family. Sometimes the most beautiful chapters of our lives begin when we think the story is over. Eleanor Morrison thought her purpose died with her husband Frank, that her empty nest would remain forever silent. At 68, facing foreclosure and drowning in loneliness, she felt invisible, another forgotten senior whose contributions no longer mattered. But when a remarkable bear cub named Marcus appeared at her door, seeking help for his dying mother, Eleanor discovered something profound. Our capacity to love and be needed doesn't diminish with age. It deepens. Frank's secret work training Marcus in medical procedures became Eleanor's unexpected inheritance, transforming her isolated cabin into a sanctuary where intelligence, compassion, and unconditional love transcend species. This isn't just a story about remarkable animals. It's about rediscovering that our wisdom, experience, and nurturing hearts are exactly what the world needs most. Eleanor learned that family isn't always the one you're born into. Sometimes it's the one that finds you when you're brave enough to open your door to the impossible. Her empty nest became full again, not with grandchildren she'd never had, but with souls who needed her unique gifts of healing and protection. Sometimes our greatest adventures begin precisely when we think we're too old to matter. What unexpected family has brought joy to your later years? Have you ever felt your life's purpose shift dramatically after retirement or loss? Share your stories in the comments below. Your experiences might inspire someone who needs to hear that their best chapters are still being written.